Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody here and get us started. My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Ethics Center at UNC Charlotte, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's talk. As part of our series on models for equitable minority inclusion in institutional research. And I'll say a little bit more about our speaker in a second, but first I want to advertise that this is not the only talk in the series. We've had a few before. Angel Harding, who's with us, Omega Wilson. Those talks are archived on the center's YouTube channel, as this one also will be. And then we have one more after this one. On March 22nd, Max Liboron of the Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research in Newfoundland will be giving a talk on colonialism and citizen science. So I want to invite everybody to that. To either find the YouTube channel or the talks, you can go to the center's website. It's ethics.uncc.edu. And there's, it's like a scroll, like a blog post, and you'll see links for the talks. On the upper right-hand corner, there's a little YouTube icon that'll take you there. Final bit of advertising, we're also doing a series on disability this year, and we have two more talks coming up on that one. On March 16th, Ashley Hsu of Virginia Tech will be talking about narratives against ableist technologies. And on April 15th, Kim Q. Hall of Appalachian State will do a talk called Cultivating Ableism, the Institutional Lives of Gardens. Everyone is welcome to all of those. So today, I want to introduce Nikita Shiel-Rolle. She is the principal research scientist at the Cat Island Conservation Institute in the Bahamas, and she is joining us from there. Her talk is called Beyond the Walls of the Ivory Tower, Perspectives on Equitable Community-Based Research. And so Nikita, all yours.
You're muted.
Of course I am. Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you and to share this talk with you. My objectives for today's talk is to inspire reflection, especially as we move now into, going into 2021, what we have left ahead of us and the years to come. I think we're at this pivotal time as researchers where we really get to redefine how we're showing up, whether it is in the laboratory, the classroom, working with our communities. And I think this is an opportunity for us to really gain clarity on what has happened, what historical events have led us to where we are at this point in history, and then how do we choose to redirect that course forward. And I think many of these points today that I'm going to reference really are at the heart of even why this series exists. There's been a number of universities throughout the United States that are having very similar conversations, not necessarily 100% about citizen science and the role of community-based and equitable research, but really how do we ensure that minority voices, that representatives from communities who are not and who have not been equitably represented and their voices have not been included into these mainstream conversations, how do we ensure that there's a place for them and that everyone understands why we're doing what we're doing? And so this is sort of what I'm going to lay out today. And then I look forward to the conversation coming forward. So I'm going to share my screen and dive into it. Okay, 1 second, please. And what's also so exciting is that I'm able to deliver this talk today from the heart of Arthurstown, Cat Island. And now, in retrospect, I'm realizing I probably should have put a map of the Bahamas and Cat Island in my presentation, which I did not, but that will be the first point of inquiry. If you do not know where Cat Island, the Bahamas is, I encourage you to consult Dr. Google and let Dr. Google inspire you. Chances are, if you Google Cat Island, you're probably going to find a lot of my Instagram. So you'll learn a lot about me. Okay, so beyond the walls of the Ivory Tower. Splendid. Okay, Beyond the Walls of the Ivory Tower, Perspectives on Equitable Community-Based Research. So these are a couple of pictures of members of my community in Cat Island. Cat Island is one of the many Bahamian islands. The Bahamas is made up of an archipelagic nation of over 700 islands. And I'm very grateful to call it home. I've also listed a few of my social media handles, whether it's Facebook and Instagram, Twitter. You can find me and also the work of the organization there. So I'm going to start this talk giving us some perspective. And I love talking about perspective because I think context matters. And context helps to frame how I see the world, but also how I see myself in the world. And I think as researchers, this is something that's critically important. And often sometimes that we take for granted. And I think there's also often some unintended biases that we have when we think about the work that we do as researchers. And so zooming all the way out, let's go out to this beautiful picture. This is the Great Nebula in Orion. And it's this was taken in 2019. This is a NASA photograph. And this is one of the closest star birth regions that we have and that we know of. And what I think is so amazing is that, I mean, if we look up and were to go all the way up, you know, this is an image of what is there, although our day-to-day lived reality, lived lives, we're not really aware or cognizant. We probably don't think much of this nebula. However, perspective, I think, is so important. And so I just wanted to give us a moment to really reflect on, we are a small part of a very, very big whole, and a big whole that we don't necessarily understand completely, which is, I think, why a lot of us do the work that we do. And this brings me to the conversation and the question of time and place. And I think this is one of the most important questions that we as researchers need to reflect on continuously, but understanding that each of us are born into time and place. And that impacts the way that we see the world, that impacts the way that we act, that impacts the language that we speak, which gives us a lens to both communicate and understand the world in which we live in. So time and place matters. And so speaking of time and place, I would like to give us a little bit of historical context. And the reason why I'm going to go on this deep dive into history right now is that when we're talking about equity in research, equity in academia, when we talk about how do we ensure that we are creating spaces where all voices feel safe and heard, we have to understand historical context and how it is that we arrived to where we are today. And so just for some historical context, in the United States, this picture on the left is from your 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, which was the abolition of slavery. And so this happened 155 years ago. And just a point of reference, in the Caribbean, so in the Bahamas, where I am currently joining you from, we had we abolished slavery, or I shouldn't say we, but the British abolished slavery in 1838, which was when, which was a little bit before, as you can see, what happened in the United States. So 1897, 124 years ago, this is a picture in the Bahamas, and I want to just make reference to, even though slavery was abolished at the time, I think all of us know that the simple abolition of slavery did not solve any problems. And if anything, it has given rise to a host of new challenges that we now have the opportunity to address. And I'm not going to read the title, but if you note on the screen, the phrase of the title of this picture, 9 little N words, a scene in the Bahamas. And so this was 124 years ago. And I share this because, again, I think context is important, how we talk about people, how how people have been respected or were not respected or not seen as equals matters. And especially as that is the foundation of how we go about doing community-based research. We're dealing with pockets of populations, of communities that we as researchers must learn to regard as equals. So moving up in time, 1939. And I like to share very interestingly too, what education looked like in the Bahamas in 1939, specifically for the Black population. And so I'm just going to read a paragraph who was part of the ruling elite in colonial era Bahamas. And so she had a school that trained butlers and housemaids. So it says here that Lady Dundas' school makes the neatest and most effective cooks, housemaids, butlers, and laundresses out of islanders with superb grace of movement and 5 metaphorical thumbs on each willing but unfortunate hand. Before the school began in the dark ages of housekeeping, years ago, it was necessary to import arrogant domestic salvation from the States. If sailors and spongers can be made into those household deities on whom our comfort and content, our appearance, our sleep, and the success of our marriages depend, I am sure Lady Dundas' domestic school will achieve the transformation. Now, this was education in the Bahamas 82 years ago. Clearly not everyone in the Bahamas was educated this way, but for the Black population, this was definitely, this is reflective of what was possible then. And now I just want to bring our attention to the fact that 82 years ago wasn't very long ago. Many of us probably still have parents or grandparents or know people who are 82 years ago. Now, bringing us to the future, this is your beautiful school. 74 years ago in 1946, UNC Charlotte was founded. And so then in 72 years ago, in 1948, so there's 2 years after UNC Charlotte was established, Queens College, which is a private school, it's not it's a private, both primary and secondary school in the Bahamas, was, so in 1948, that was the first time a Black student entered the school. And so this is Nicolette Bethel. She's Dr. Nicolette Bethel is a renowned Bahamian anthropologist. And she, in one of her memoirs, speaks to not until 1948, just as my uncle was leaving the school and my mother was entering her final year there, did someone who was unequivocally of full African descent gain admittance. And it took even longer for the school to gain a population, which, like the country, was predominantly Black. Now, I share this context around education because time and place impacts how we see the world. And so this is something that we must acknowledge, especially as researchers, and especially those of us who are working in or have the intentions of working with communities. Because each of us bring different perspectives to the table, and based on where we were born, the opportunities we were afforded, and how we were educated, all of this matters. And so how we see the world impacts how and why we do research and who has access to that information. Now, I want us just to sit here for a second because I think the first 2 questions, or the 2 points, how and why we do research, is extremely important. And I'm not sure if that's something that you have had a chance to really reflect on. And this is something that I like to encourage people to reflect on, because the motivation for why we do our research influences how we do our research, and then ultimately who it is that we communicate our research with. And if we are not intentional with really understanding why it is that we do our research, then I think we open ourselves up for huge biases in the way that we do our research. And I believe this is now the opportunity that academia in 2021 and beyond gets to address. You know, I think there is this need for a hearty acknowledgement that the why we have been doing our research, often, especially in academia, is driven by this desire to expand our knowledge and understanding of the world, which is awesome. However, if that is the why, simply to expand our knowledge and understanding of the world, we have to remember that there's a privilege in that. And that if we do not acknowledge the privilege in the intention to produce knowledge for the sake of purely just understanding it and expanding the breadth of knowledge that exists in the world, I think there's a challenge there. Similarly, when we do this research, who then has access to it? And we all know, especially I think probably most people on this talk today probably have been or are affiliated with an academic institution. And while there is a shift and there are more open access journals, there's still a lot that's behind a paywall, right? English is the predominant language for academic publications, but yet English in many ways does not have words or vocabulary that can describe aspects of the world in which we live, such as, for example, you know, in the indigenous language of Potawatomi. If you haven't, I would encourage you to read the book Braiding Sweetgrass. It's an excellent discussion on language and research and sort of combining or analysis of the indigenous way of studying and understanding the world and the Western academic way of studying the world. So with that, I want to ask you, why is it that you do research? Do you have that why? Do you know what that why is? Are you still trying to figure it out? So this is my why. I do research primarily for climate action. Charles Hamilton, a dear friend and colleague of mine at the UN 75th anniversary last year, addressed the United Nations, speaking on behalf of people throughout the Caribbean, but specifically being a voice for young people. And he shared a sentiment of the UNESCO Caribbean Climate Change Youth Network, of which I am part of, that, you know, for those of us in small island states, it's do or we die. We don't really have a choice. And so this is where research transcends, in my world, beyond the doing research simply to expand our knowledge and understanding, but really where it turns into action. And it turns into research as a tool to save lives. Because at the end of the day, for those of us who live in coastal communities and island nations, and many parts of the United States and really all over the world, there are serious threats that we are faced with. And we need the most effective way to be able to address that. And for me, I believe research is a tool that will enable us to take climate action. And so just putting things into perspective for small island nations like the Bahamas, half a degree matters, each year matters, each choice matters. And this is why I love research and I love data, because it helps us understand and put ourselves into perspective as to where we are right now and where it is that we need to go. And so the data is pretty clear as to where we need to go. as far as we know that we need to come up with climate solutions. However, where we're struggling, I think, as a global community in some ways, is exactly what does that look like? How do we ground this big idea of climate solutions into tangible action on the ground that really drives change, and equitable change? And so this is where a lot of my work lies. A lot of my research is at the intersection of science, society, and policy, and really looking at how do we close the policy, science, society feedback loop within the Bahamas to enable us to create resilient island communities. And so again, I'm shifting, so taking our research tools now and talking about this within this bigger system of intersections between how we learn about ourselves and the world in which we live through science, how we understand the needs of society, how we ensure that societal needs are being met, and then also how do we ensure that policy is designed and implemented that reflects the needs of society and is also reflective of the best science possible, right? And so I think there needs to be a balance here, and in many ways there's an imbalance. This system is not yet functioning in the way that we need it to function, that we want it to function. Specifically because we have major gaps in how science, society, and policy are interfacing. They're not interfacing in the most effective way. And this is where we need innovation, we need an educational paradigm shift. And this, I think, is possible through strategic local, national, regional, and global partnerships on climate solutions. And this requires us to be willing to expand our comfort zone, to step beyond the way that we have seen the world, the way that we, I think, and some of our limitations to our understanding of research and how research is used and who has access to or should be the ones creating the research. And this brings me to creating a climate resilient Bahamas. And so really for island nations, we can't do anything now without talking about climate resilience, whether we're having public health conversations, whether we're having conversations about biodiversity, or we're having conversations about our economic recovery. You know, the impacts of climate change are real and alive. And this requires evidence-based adaptive management in order to address. And then also this requires education specific for climate solutions. You'll recall in the beginning of my conversation when I spoke about or shared insights on education in the Bahamas, you'll see that we have not really had equitable access to quality education. Specifically the Bahamians, or people, and I'm going to extend this to the Caribbean region, we have not been educated to thrive and flourish on these islands that we live and that we call home. And so this is where the paradigm shift is required. And so I fundamentally believe that Bahamians from all walks of life must be long-term active participants in the co-creation of our resilient island communities. And to accomplish this, how we engage our community and volunteers matter, how we start working with citizen scientists, how we train citizen scientists matter. And there really has to be this shift from this us versus them academic and community member to this more inclusive, equitable, we're a team working collectively on a shared problem. And I believe, and this is at the heart of the work that we do with the Catalan Conservation Institute, that research skills are a tool for climate solutions and social justice. And those of us who have spent lots of time within the Ivory Tower, we know how valuable these research skills are. We study for years developing them and refining them. And then once we have them masters, we write papers and publish in peer-reviewed, high-impact, preferably journals, to share the knowledge that we've learned based on these research skills. But the thing is, the people who are actually reading these high-impact journals, these articles within these high-impact journals, or any journal really, it's still a minority of the population. And I'm using minority now, not in the way that I think minority is being used in this series, referring to people of color or indigenous people, but I'm using minority in this sense where there's a handful of people who have access to the knowledge of how we conduct research, and then the critical thinking that then provides for us to dive into a problem and to dissect it, understand it, and then propose solutions based on, what it is that we have learned. And I think this is where it becomes really important for us as those in who take up space in academia, who take up space in research, to realize that within time and place, so within 2021, we have a choice of how we show up. We have a choice on how it is that we use these research skills that are a privilege, and how it is that the information that we garner, what that is for. And so I think this idea of choice is extremely important, because it matters from how you interact with students in your class to how you show up when you're in the lab or you're in the field, and even more importantly, when you're in the community or seeking to facilitate relationships as university faculty with communities that you want to work with. Remember, because when you're moving into a community, when you're starting to work in a community, you're coming from a perspective of time and place, just as your counterpart is. And understanding the differences that our perspective has in time and place is critically important. And then acknowledging that we have choice of how we move forward. That if we choose to perpetuate these systems of injustice that exist within the halls of our university, that's a choice that we have to own. Or we choose that we're part of creating a new system that's dismantling this hierarchy, that's preventing, true evidence-based driven solutions. So my question to you then is, how are you using your power and privilege? Are there ways that you think you can do more? Perhaps there's a need for you to better understand how your perspective, how you being born in time and place impacts the way you view the world, the way you do your science, the way you show up when you work with communities, or whether it's policymakers. Are there perspectives that are not being taken into consideration when you're designing your research projects? Are there unintended biases that exist because of your privilege? And so this is where it takes us to the work of the Catalan Conservation Institute, is that our focus is really on developing research skills throughout the entire community. So we do, of course, a lot of work with high school students, and this can fall under the understanding of citizen science, where we are helping our students to develop skills to be able to participate in science. But really what my end goal is training community members to work as co-researchers, as equitable partners in understanding the world in which we live in, so that we can have the data that can help us make more informed and better informed decisions. And one of the reasons for this, for me, is going back to the topic of climate solutions. Without data, without sound information between science, society, and policy, we're not going to, I think we're going to be very challenged to be able to effectively move forward. And so in the very beginning of my talk, you would have seen this symbol. It's this Triskel or Triskelion. It's one of the oldest Neolithic symbols that we have on Earth, or that we know of, I should say. Many different cultures have their own significant meaning for sort of these spirals. However, I think they beautifully illustrate how the relationship between science, society, and policy should seamlessly flow, where we are able to, we have the skills, we have the science skills, we have the research skills, where we can understand the world in which we live, where we can help understand ourselves, and that when society has access to these research skills, that this then enables us to be in a better position to inform policy, to advise how is it that we truly want to be governed as a society, and what policy is in our best interest for the long term of whether it's our community, our island, our region, our world. And mending, or really establishing this connection, this feedback loop between science, society, and policy is going to be critical for us to achieve our 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. But really, when you think about how is it that you and we work with our communities, I go back to the why. Why is it that you want to work with communities? Why are you choosing to work with communities? And are you choosing, and as you are working with communities, is it equitable? Are you sitting really at the same table with the same skills to be able to engage in meaningful conversations, or is there an imbalance? And I feel like a lot of the community work often that has happened, it hasn't been based on equitable relationships with community members. And so this is where the work that we do at the Catalan Conservation Institute is really about how do we remove barriers to access and to participation in science? How do we ensure that we can equip our community with research skills so that they have the powerful tools of science at their disposal, and so that can improve quality of life for all? And one of the ways that we see that happen is through policy. And so with that, I want to thank you. I just want to share that the words on my screen right here are in Amharic, and it says Katafatro gar mesmamat, which is harmony with nature. And I fundamentally believe that in order for us to move forward with our work, we have to learn how to live in harmony with each other, which means we have to understand perspective, the differences in our perspective, and use our science and our research skills to chart our course forward. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass the floor on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nikita. I want to, so Angel Harding has foolishly or graciously volunteered to help facilitate the conversation. So I just want to hand the floor over to her now.
Awesome, thank you. So what you don't know is that Nikita and I have a very long history together of working together, and there is we can have additional conversations about that outside of this meeting, because this is not about me, this is about Nikita and the work she's doing. But we have worked together on the founding of Cat Island Conservation Institute, and I'm really grateful to have been part of this journey with her and to have learned so much through the work that she has done, and also through the Cat Islanders that I've worked with and we are working with together. So, but I do have some questions to kind of tie this together, and so for us to talk about before we hand this, open up the floor to discussion from the audience. I think the first thing that I want to ask you to share is you talk about equitable community research. So let's go there first. So what does equitable community research look like to you? Like if you were to write some best practices, like what are like 3 best practices for equitable community research? What does that look like that you could share? Muted.
Take 2. So I want to acknowledge that this is community-based research, I think, takes many different shapes and forms depending on the community, depending on the subject matter. And so I think that needs to be taken into consideration. With that being said, at its core, the first thing I would say is, are you seeing your co-researchers or the community members that you're working with, that the value that they're bringing to the table, is that, do you regard that as equal to and on the same level as the value that you bring? Okay, so that's my first question. And I think that is a point to reflect on. And I think it's moving from there. I think it is, of course, we all bring different perspectives. Now, if you worked in university and your specialty is research protocol, whatever it is, that is a skill. It's a skill that you have that your community member may not have, right? But if that skill, those methodologies are critical to being able to answer and to further your research, then I think the responsibility lies on you, the lead researcher, to ensure that the people that you're engaging with have the skills to actually meet you at the table. Because it is unfair if you go into a community with your 8 years of university experience and throw these questions out or seeking participation and engagement, but you haven't actually trained the community members in the skill that you're using to answer the question, right? And so I think this is where acknowledging that research as a skill, and that lens is very important. So that would be my first point. My second point is historical context. Okay, especially if you're coming from a university, especially if you do not look like and are not from that community in which you are working in. Historical context, and pay someone to work with you so that you understand that historical context. Because as a foreigner, doesn't matter how long you have been a foreigner in that community, you will never be part of that community. And this is something that I know can be very painful for people who've worked in communities for so long and have this strong emotional connection to the communities in which they love. And we want to believe at times that we are part of the community. And in some ways you are, and in many ways you aren't, right? Because if you're not living there, if you're not sleeping there, if you're not eating there, if you don't deal with the day-to-day realities of someone in there, then that's a problem, okay? 2, if you're talking about, if your $1 million, I think, was it Omega spoke about this, and I just want to reemphasize this. If you were getting $1 million grant to do research and your research hinges on what it is that this community has to tell you, that is a job. You need their expertise. You need to pay them equitably, not pennies, but you have to pay them what is that information? How valuable is that information to you? And if that information is valuable, then pay them what that information is worth, right? Because the only way that we can redistribute the way that we are doing research is to actually change the way that we are doing research. We have to change it. We got to change the system. And this requires the acknowledgement that the way that we got started was not equal, right? While the University of North Carolina, Charlotte was being founded, Black people in the Bahamas couldn't go to couldn't go to what was a private school, which was of course the best level of education. So we're not starting off on the same point. And I think that's something that we have to learn to lovingly acknowledge. And I feel like sometimes the acknowledgement of that can become very triggering for people, because this is where it gets to shame, blame, and guilt, sort of all these feelings start welling up. And so this is where my last point is self-awareness. Every single person, it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in an academic institution, you're working online at McDonald's, we need to learn how to, remember I started the talk, time and space, time and place, perspective, to be able to see ourselves, the perspective in which we are coming from, and how that interconnects with others. And often where we are challenged is that we assume that our lived realities are the same as everyone else's. And it's that false assumption that has us in this place of unrest today, because most white people cannot acknowledge that their lived reality was very different. And it doesn't mean that struggle doesn't exist or struggle didn't exist, but it's just that the realities were different. And we have to acknowledge that. And we have to be able to acknowledge what is to move forward. And this is why when I talk about self-awareness, I'm talking about an approach based on Black feminist theory, Barbara Love, and also Bell Hooks, love ethic, using love, care, and compassion, where I'm not going to shame, blame you, or judge you, because that doesn't get us anywhere. But lovingly, we have to be able to talk about what really is and then move forward. And that requires each of us developing the skills of love, care, and compassion, developing skills of listening, developing skills of taking a beat, pausing, moving from our head. I know we love to live in our head as academics. We live there so much, like full palace space, but we also have to get down into our heart, and the change will happen when you, as a professor, as an administrator, as a postdoc, as a director of an institution, that you are practicing this love ethic with your students of all races and sexes and gender orientations, right? Because it's about the acknowledging the humanity that exists, and then enabling then the science and research to be a skill that we as loving, kind, compassionate, caring people use to advance the world.
Ooh, that's some good stuff, girl. So I want to switch it a little bit from the love. I love talking about love with you, but I want to talk about something else that you mentioned that I also know is problematic, especially in the Bahamian context. And that's extractive research, and that is really what has driven the need to push forward this community science diverse program, which Nikita did not talk about any of the programmatic work. This was more broader, higher level. And that's something I know that she would love to talk to you further about if you are interested in the programmatic type of work she's doing to advance this. But I would like to talk, or for you to talk about and address this idea of extractive research and what impact has that had on the community, and how can researchers in academic spaces, how can they avoid this? What can they do to help do better?
Great question. And so the reason why we went all the way back to the abolition of slavery was because perspective matters. And so as we are, Angel, can you please just, the main point of that, I just lost my train of thought.
Let's talk about extractive research.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, so the reason why I went back there is because it was important to acknowledge that the skills to do the science do not exist in many communities, right? And in the Bahamas, this has been something that we've been challenged by, is that, our university is only 4 years old. So we do not have this long history of researchers in country who have the capacity to be driving research and innovation. And so because of this, for many reasons, the Bahamas is this incredible destination. For both, especially for biodiversity, we are a hotspot for universities who come bring their students for their research, whether it has to do with biodiversity underwater, above the water, history, understanding Lucayans, the indigenous people, or even colonial history. Everything you can imagine, research happens in the Bahamas. And now where the problem is that when people come in, do research and leave, all this information about our country leaves with them. And so I am happy to share that there has been some changes specifically in the biodiversity space by the government of the Bahamas that is sort of preventing this extractive science. However, in history and other spaces, it still happens. And where this becomes hugely problematic, and I'm going to address a couple points. So one, US Western universities primarily come into the Caribbean, and I'm going to speak from a regional perspective here, come into the region and conduct their research, publish their articles in whatever journal it is. The reality is, because the inequity exists, universities, institutions throughout the region often don't have access to the same publications that you guys are publishing in. And so what has happened over and over again with my colleagues from Jamaica is that they will do research based on and do their lit review based on the journals that they have access to, which is not everything, right? But that means their lit review is incomplete. And then the research that they conduct is incomplete. And then when they go to publish in probably one of the high impact journals that everyone wants to publish in, it's rejected because the study was already done, or all the many different things, right? And so what we have is we're creating this knowledge deficit between the global north and the global south. In addition to that, what you have happening is that now countries like mine, who are dealing with the challenges of the climate crisis, we need capacity to help us navigate out of this. And we have limited capacity in country. What's fantastic is it's changing. And there are many now Bahamians who have degrees and expertise, but we still need a lot more help. And so then we go to the top institutions. Usually this is through some program funded by, whether it's the Inter-American Development Bank or some other global fund. And consultants are identified, and they come in from one of these Western universities. And then they're now advising on how to develop and what needs to happen in our country based on the research, right, that they've done. But again, going back to the beginning of my presentation, perspective is everything. And if a lot of this research often is done, you parachuting in, you're there over a spring break, you're not really collecting the full picture, the full understanding of, you're not getting a full story. And I think at the heart of it, it's that often the science really is incomplete. And this is why when it comes to extractive research, absolutely, I think, and it's a big part, I think, especially in the marine sciences where my expertise lie, it's a big thing. You want to go and you want to study another part of the world and you want to explore and learn something new. And I think there is space for that. And I think we can, I think that will continue to be possible. However, how you engage with your counterparts, it's not acceptable to just come in, drop in with a university, your group for a week or so, and then skedaddle without telling anyone really what's going on in that community. They see you, they just see this foreign group, but they don't really know what you're doing. And no one's taken the time to communicate. And even if you communicate, are you communicating in a way that is relevant to them and that they understand? And so extractive research is probably one of the greatest challenges that we have, because researchers from these foreign institutions do not understand the damage that they are doing, and they do not understand how they're perpetuating systems of inequity. And so this is going to take a long time for us to restructure, right? Because our institutions have very strict ways of doing things. But this is why the work that I do, and my title, Beyond the Walls of the Ivory Tower, because we now, I think as we move into the future, we have to enable ourselves to expand how we use research, how we see research, and how research is used to advance humanity. And that humanity has to be our global community and not just those who have access to the information published behind a paywall.
All right, so I have one last question for you, and then I'm going to turn it over to, I'm sure there are some people that are itching to ask you some questions. But I want to ask you about resources and specifically about funding. And thinking about that, this is one area that we have dealt with a lot. In the academic spaces, we deal with funding a lot and writing grants and all these things. What are some of the steps you've taken to find funding to do the work you're doing? And how can academic institutions better partner with you on the funding front to be good, to be good partners in helping you get this work done on a funding space?
That's an excellent question. And it's something that's so very relevant. Most of our Caribbean islands, we don't even have a line item in our national budget for research, right? So who's funding research in the Bahamas? It's not Bahamians, right? And so this is something that we are trying to change, specifically with the Catalan Conservation Institute, because we acknowledge that the only way that we can, for example, become leaders in the blue economy is for there to be research being done about our oceans. There's steps to how we do these things. And one of the great challenges for Bahamian researchers is that it's hard for us, and not just Bahamian, but regionally, it's hard for us to tap into these funding pots. And so what we've done with our organization is actually we have established a US 501c3, and Angel is actually the chair of our board, our US 501c3, which has enabled us to have access to additional funding resources. But I think any researcher institution who's looking to really do meaningful community-based work, looking to take and study anything outside of your home community, I think there is a responsibility there to ensure that you're not just going in and you're taking things, but that you're actually being part of helping to ensure the sustainability of and the transfer of knowledge into and between. Because yes, as a foreigner's coming in, there's a lot that you can teach us, but there's also a lot we have to teach you. And so really understanding that there is this reciprocity. And I think one of the greatest ways that we can, and people in spaces who are writing grants and looking for research funding, is to really engage your partners in the grant writing process, in the co-creation of those projects. So it's not you have this idea and then you come to them and you're like, hey, can you do this part of this big project? But no, that they're actually co-researchers with you, right? So that it's equitable from the beginning, understanding that people bring different skills to the table. And especially if you're coming from an institution, that's established, you have access to resources that, many Caribbean institutions will not have. But that is one of the greatest challenges. For example, we don't have a PhD program in the country. We don't have a master's degree program in the country. Now what's great, COVID-19 is changing things, right? It's changing things so we can access a lot virtually, which is fantastic. However, we still need to be able to fund that. We still need to find the money to be able to do the research. And so I think this is where really meaningful partnerships, you can do tremendous things with meaningful and equitable partnerships. And this is something that Angel and I really have been building over these past few years. And so I would encourage you, if you are writing grants working in communities that are not your own, make sure you have people from those communities who are part of the inception, the creation, the ideation of the project, not just the bucket that you think they will fill, because you don't know the full picture. And so you need to give them a chance to meet you so that both of these, the diverse ideas can come together to create, I think, a strong ask.
All right. So thank you for answering excellent answers to my questions. Now it's everybody else's turn. Either post them in the chat box, and I'll help keep an eye on any of those coming through, or just feel free to unmute yourself and give it a go.
So you talked about how when you're dealing with people in the local area, you want to make sure that you reimburse them for their work. When you're going into an area, say myself, I'm going to UNCC, and then I go into an area, what's a good way to find the individuals so that you can hire them? And then when you're hiring them, what's a good way? Is it like writing a grant? How do you do it properly? Because you might have a grant and they're coming from a different country, and you want to make sure you compensate them accordingly. What's the process if you have an answer? Just a whiz.
So this is where I think community-based research and academically focused driven research often kind of have some butting of heads, because my immediate answer to you would be, well, how do you find people? You go and you spend time in that community, right? So when I moved to Cat Island, I started hosting paint nights, right? Had nothing to do with my research, but it was an event that brought people together, that built community, that enabled me to get to know people in my community besides just numbers, but to understand their lived reality and to develop meaningful relationships. And meaningful relationships are at the heart of community-driven conservation or community-driven research. And now, of course, when you're dealing with an academic timeline of like, I have to do this in X amount of time, this is where it becomes challenging when we try to force academic expectations or what the standard way of doing things within, because the minute you start engaging with a community, this is the beginning of a lifelong relationship. And I think that is the approach that you need to take with it. If you're not really investing, because often what happens, and this is, I think, one of the greatest challenges with academic driven community research projects, is that because they're so driven by the research question, it's very selfish in motivation. From what the researcher gets out of it, as opposed to understanding what the community needs. Because we both have, the community and the researcher have reasons, they have whys for participating in this. And often our whys may not be the same, but it's, I think, the responsibility of the researcher, the university researcher, to be aware, why are your community members participating? What is the motivation for their participation? And then I think that then needs to inform. But yeah, community-driven research requires a lot of contact hours in community, developing relationships, understanding and having conversations about things that have zero to do with really what your research question is. But that's the only way that we meaningfully connect with people. And in regards to compensation, absolutely, I think there needs to be there should be a line item for your community practitioners in your budget, because I mean, people's time is people's time. We all have, our time is all equally valuable. And if you're being paid $150, $300 an hour, to do this research, why isn't the person who actually has the ability to give you the data that you need, their time is just equally as valuable? So we have to seriously take compensation into consideration.
So I was a question sort of brewing. I was struck by your comment about journal access, because I do enough about intellectual property that I've heard it, I'm aware of this issue. That there are so many, I'll call it infrastructural barriers that are just the norm for how Western research happens, right? So we have to find our VPN, our login, and then we have access to all these journals. But these are things that are thousands of dollars a year per journal in many cases to have access to. So and that's just one, right? Or, to write a grant that meets NSF reporting requirements, oh dear God, you need someone on your staff full time whose job it is to understand the stupid changing reporting requirements. So I'm sort of struck by, there's really two processes at work here, right? One is when Western academics make sure to be appropriately inclusive and equitable. The other is that there's an unmet and really challenging capacity, just financial capacity problem for a Bahamian institution to be able to have the staff support, the library. And I don't know if that's a question, but I was really struck by how there's this whole other issue that gets downplayed in the way the knowledge economy is being set up.
It's so, I love that you brought both those points up, because it's very significant. And this is when we talk about privilege. You don't think about it when you log into your university library and you're like, ding, 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 you're doing your search and getting your articles, but then it hits you hard when you return, like when I returned home, and then you realize, oh, I don't have access to that anymore. And that's kind of like the slap in the face, because this access you had to the world, to knowledge, to information, is now like literally overnight limited. And this is why I spend a lot of time in the open science space. I do work very much at the UN level and UNESCO, and I believe open science is a big part of this, is that we have to ensure that everyone understands science, the scientific processes, from how we collect data to how we communicate it, how we store the data, how we understand it. And so especially, because again, going back to the why we do research, the why informs everything. And when, for me, the why is, how do we save lives? Well, I think science and research has the ability to save lives. We know that. We see this with COVID, but you see it in many different ways, but also when it comes from a sustainable development perspective, research, there's so much power in research, but if we do not have access to it, then we are in a very dire situation and we are extremely disadvantaged. And again, this is another way that, I think equitable research partnerships throughout the region, but not just regionally, but between global North and global South, right? These inequities exist, and there's something that we have to be intentional in addressing. And unfortunately, much like the mitigation of climate change, the actors who have the power, who hold the power, really are those of you who are part of the Western academic institutions, right? So this is where you have to really take a good hard look. What power do you hold? What privilege do you hold? And what are you going to do with it? Because I can only do what I can from my island, right? But I need, whether I'm talking about climate change or I'm talking about open science, I am sort of roadblocked by the fact that I need the Western community, but not just me. We need the global North to be hand in hand with us as we move forward. And that's the only way we're going to move forward.
So Heather posted in the chat sort of a follow-up on this whole conversation around publishing. And she says, I certainly haven't thought about the fact that articles are being rejected due to this lack of access to material for literature review. How do you find that Caribbean researchers work around this issue in order to get their research onto that larger stage?
So it's a really good question. Unfortunately, we're still trying to figure out the workaround. This is why you'll see often, there was a report that I think this was last year that came out from UNESCO in their open science that spoke to where Caribbean researchers, who they're publishing with. And so often Caribbean researchers aren't lead authors. They're co-authors on a paper where there's the lead is from a US institution, or not US, but Western, US, European, Canadian institution. So that's one of the main ways, but this is also a challenge because now it's preventing regional collaboration, which is critically important, but we don't have the access. So it's sort of like, how do you get your voice on the main stage? Well, you got to work with someone who already has access to that. So this is definitely one of the challenges I'm seeing. Yeah, so again, I mean, of course, there's like, so I think social media, probably especially everyone who's in academic Twitter has, there's access to a point, but even so, if Twitter, if you tweet an article and it's still behind a paywall, it's still behind a paywall, right? And so I think this is something I don't have a quick fix for this. This is a big, big issue. And unfortunately, this is why you don't see many Caribbean, I mean, there are, and I want to be very clear, like obviously there are incredible scientists, Bahamian, Caribbean scientists who are publishing in high impact factor journals. However, we're still severely challenged with what they can access. And usually if you are someone from the region and you're publishing in a high impact factor journal, you're probably not based in the region, right? You're probably based at an institution outside of the country, working on work about the country that you're from.
So that was a really interesting suggestion you posted in the chat, Gordon, about potentially writing that university access into a grant. I hadn't even thought about that.
It just popped into my head, but if you're going to pay the participants for their time and you want them to participate as equals, then they ought to have access to the same research materials that you do. And that's the sort of thing that I can imagine, being in a budget, right? I can sort of see how this would be a fundable thing, right? So it might actually translate into something you can actually do.
That's an excellent idea. But see, I think this is what's so powerful about this type of conversation is that when we can put diverse perspectives together, we can now co-create solutions.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we've really struggled over is that bringing me on full time when I'm finishing my postdoc, but that me losing access to university resources is how much that's going to hurt the work that we're doing. And so, what would that look like and how do we address that? I don't know. But right now we don't have to deal with it, but it's coming. I mean, my postdoc contract ends at the end of June, right? So in July, if we want to go write and publish, what do we do? And how do we handle that? Sala posted a really great question for you, Nikita. I don't know if you saw that. How do you deal with racial comments and attitudes from outside researchers that are there doing research in your community?
Oh, girl, that's a question. So last week I was at a local resort, beautiful resort, speaking with colleagues talking about protected area management and the establishment of both, how do we inspire our community to be part and drivers of creating this marine protected area, and also as we're exploring the establishment of a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, which is the nature equivalent to a World Heritage Site. So I'm at this bar having this conversation, and there was a foreigner. Now this wasn't a researcher, but this was a business owner who overheard the conversation that I was having, and the first comment that the person said to me was, "Oh, strategic, you're using some big words." Yeah, right. And so from there, I knew exactly what was happening. And so for 2 hours, I had to handle this sort of fiery dig from this older gentleman who couldn't process the fact that I was an expert and just kept, trying to tear down my very existence. And so I share that to say, now this person isn't a scientist, but he's a business owner. He's part of my community now. And in the same respect, I remember in my very early years, I had many foreign scientists, would comment about how ambitious I was in a very sort of condescending way. And it's a challenge, dealing with foreign entities who are not part of your community, who do not see you as an expert because of the color of your skin or your gender, and undermine you and undervalue you and disrespect you. It's really frustrating. And I personally have done a lot of work and continue to do a lot of work to be able to have confidence to hold my own in those spaces. But I think really what needs to happen now, there's another matter, that I'm currently working with. This actually has nothing to do with me, but has to do with another Bahamian who missed an opportunity on a research trip to a foreigner, that shouldn't happen in country, right? Because these experiences should be afforded to Bahamians who are trying to advance their skill set, not to foreigners. But when the agency that's offering the internship is a foreign agency, then there's really no preference, or there's no laws that govern. And so I think what needs to happen, and this is something that I've been reflecting on now, is how do we have these conversations within our science community, which is very foreign in the Bahamas, to make sure that there is this attention and attentiveness to disparity and equity, and ensure that we can lovingly resolve this. But honestly, I cry a lot, Sala. There's a lot of crying, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of rage. And then I when I show up, I smile and I do what I have to do, but it's really difficult. It's really difficult when you're dealing with sometimes foreigners who don't respect you within your own country.
These are tough conversations. I mean, these are big, tough things to address. And like, where do you even start to dismantle and unravel and deal with? And, they're uncomfortable to talk about too.
Absolutely. And this is why I go back to the work of Bell Hooks and Barbara Love, which is, again, all comes from Black feminist theory, but how we show up in the office, in the classroom, in the grocery line matters, right? We as individual researchers, as just human beings, must become aware of when we're in a space, if we are in a position of dominance, and if we are in a position of dominance, how are we ensuring that any minority in this group, whether it be gender or sexual orientation or race or religion or how are we ensuring that they are not being excluded, that they're not being oppressed, that our actions are not subconsciously oppressing them? Because the reason, again, when I started my talk about time and place, I did that because time and place, our first 7 years of life, impact how our subconscious is formed and how we see the world. And so if you are a 40-something-year-old who was raised in a southern part of the United States that had primarily racist actions and ways of being, there's going to be a lot of traits and habits and norms that are part of how you show up that you may not even be aware that you are doing. But this is where the responsibility is on you to really start learning and to become aware. And I always like to say, when I know better, I do better, right? So this is a continual experience of us learning, but you have to own it. You have to own that you are responsible for being and creating the future that we all share together. And that means all of us, because myself, while I am a Black woman, I'm a very educated Black woman, and that comes with its own set of privilege, right? And so that's something that I confront and I deal with every day. You know, just like that gentleman that I shared with you, he doesn't know how to deal with a Black woman who has brains. Like, he can't even conceive that, because strategic is a big word apparently coming out of my mouth, right? Actually, I responded to that. I was like, oh, actually, no, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. That's a big word. That was my response. But I say that to say is that, yes, these are heavy conversations. Yes, it's challenging. Yes, it's ouchy, because it means that we got to look inside and be like, ooh, maybe I haven't been showing up as my best self. Or maybe I didn't know that I was doing something that was hurtful to someone, right? But we have to go there. And so this is why I'm going to bring back love, care, and compassion, is that we have to learn to live together. We have to learn to play together. We have to learn to love together. And love isn't the cushy, gushy emotion that many people think it is. Love is being able to sit and have a really tough conversation that hurts and that is uncomfortable. But we do it because we know we have to do it, because this is how we get to know each other, and this is how we move forward collectively. So when I talk about love, it's not because it's all ushy gushy. No, love is painful sometimes. The truth is hard, but we have to own it. And we have to lovingly do that. And we have to do that with care and compassion, both for ourselves and for those who we're engaging with.
Does anybody else want to add anything further? That would be a wonderful moment to end on, I have to say. Okay, well, so let me thank first Angel, but then even more so Nikita. This was a fantastic talk. There was so much good stuff that came out, and I'm really honored to have been able to host it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an excellent conversation, and I hope that you've gotten nuggets so that you can reflect on now as you go on throughout your day. And definitely please reach out to me. I'm pretty active on social media, and email, all the things. I would love to connect.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And we hope to see you next time.